Hi, I'm Zala Fashant, and you're joining us for the Online Course Design Institute OCDI 2. This is actually a review of the Chapter 2 material and gives you a chance with a little extra information in here that isn't actually in the book, Designing Effective Teaching and Significant Learning. So I'm glad you joined us. I'm glad you're watching this ahead of time as you go through the materials that are in this chapter. This is kind of the I would say in American slang, the meat and potatoes. This is the main course of a lot of things that need to be done in course design. And so as we take a look at it, you'll see all the different things that we have listed out here that can become important in course design. In OCDI 1, we actually took a look at the situational factors, and in OCDI 2, we're really taking a look at the alignment of the learning outcomes, the feedback and assessment, and the opportunities for us to be able to design the teaching and learning activities that all make sense. And so we're going to go through this. It's a little thick, it's a little heavy. It's one of the bigger chapters in the book, but at the same time, I want to kind of explain some of the thinking behind all of this as you go through it. So we're really calling this the integrated course design. And the first part of that is going to be creating outcomes. And that is what drives everything. So this is a picture or a graphic that was done by Dee Fink back in around 2003. And one of the things, Dee actually wrote the foreword for our book. And we've worked with Dee. Some of our authors have worked closely with Dee in course design. And one of the things that we changed learning goals to learning outcomes, because it's a term that's used a little bit more often in a lot of campuses. Some people use learning objectives, but as we use learning outcomes, it's really for course outcomes and how these tie into institutional or program outcomes as well. And this model really kind of showed a little bit of Dee's philosophy at the time, back in 2003, 20 years ago, as to what it takes to create significant learning. And if you do the things that build up, you'll notice that it forms kind of a pyramid that builds up to significant learning. We've expanded upon that because we think that in today's age, there's many more things that we need to add in there and consider to be able to help deliver significant learning. So let's take a look at, as I said, we changed learning outcomes. That becomes kind of an important piece there. Many of you, when you really want to design outcomes, you probably heard of Bloom's taxonomy, which is something I grew up into in the College of Education that I went to. Everything was Bloom's, and this is Bloom's cognitive version of the taxonomy he created. And you know, people were really looking at being able to use the remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, create, kind of a hierarchy that moved up from easier concepts to more difficult, higher level concepts. The taxonomy that Fink created on the left-hand side of significant learning works with these 6 pieces of the pie. And in a course, you will notice that all 6 exist in a course. In Bloom's taxonomy, you don't have to have all 6, but in Dee's work, he really talked about having these 6, which were foundational knowledge, application, integration, the human dimensions of learning about oneself and others, which is newer to a lot of people because they haven't worked with that, and the caring or the valuing of developing new feelings, interests, values. And then finally, a piece that becomes extremely important that doesn't always show up in Bloom's cognitive side. It shows up in other things, but it's this learning how to learn, how you become a better student, how you take the learning and create more significant lifelong learning. You'll notice that everything in Bloom's cognitive is over in Dee Fink's right-hand side of the pie. The foundational knowledge, the application, the integration, all those pieces are there. The left-hand side of the pie are really the affective pieces. And as we've worked with college and university faculty, they not only want students to have that cognitive knowledge, but they want them to be able to develop an affective side, the set of domains to be able to go and do a lot more with people, with the inner valuing, and with the learning how to learn pieces. And so we've chosen to really continue on and talk about the taxonomy of significant learning because we think it's a little more holistic than the side that Bloom had with just the cognitive. Now, if you do research Bloom a little bit more, you will see that he also has an affective triangle or pyramid that was created. And so you can do more work, but this as one single graphic really kind of lays this all out for people. And we find that's a little easier to come back and use this to get that holistic approach. So when we look at Bloom's taxonomy of affective domains, we really look at, these are the affective sides again. You look at there's the receiving, the responding, the valuing, the organization, which is again, integrating and comparing values to do something with those values, and characterization. So you see there is more. You can certainly take a look at those and do more with it. It also gives you kind of some verbs that go along with that in the affective domains that you can create those. So you now have those kind of 10 items that you have from Bloom's, or 11 items that you have from Bloom's side of it to be able to work together, or you have the 6 that you can use from Think. So let's break those down. Again, foundational knowledge, application, integration, those are the cognitive side, the human dimension, the caring and valuing, and the learning how to learn are the affective side. So one of the things that faculty told us was, I've never seen Fink's taxonomy before and found it very useful. The emphasis on a math course for educating the entire person and providing lifelong learning has always been very important to me. Fink's taxonomy helps to emphasize the transfer of knowledge, not only to other disciplines, but to future personal and professional aspects of each student's life. Isn't a competition. We don't think that you should use Fink's taxonomy and throw away Bloom's. If you like Bloom's, stick with Bloom's and do that, use it. We're not saying you have to use one versus the other. We're just simply saying that in our work, we have found that faculty have found this to be extremely useful, and that's why we're sharing it in chapter 2. And when you break this down, let's give you a little bit more information. The foundational knowledge really consists of new information, ideas. The application definition is there. You'll find this actually as figure 2.1 in chapter 2. So I'm not going to read all this with you. I just want to point out that it's there. This information is there for you, helps to break this down. If you're a little unfamiliar with it, helps you to kind of get a better look at what it is that we've been talking about in this course design chapter. So Fink's taxonomy is outward looking, another participant told us, going beyond this foundational and application aspects. It provides a way to have a more outward looking, beyond the course teaching philosophy for students by designing for the human dimensions, caring, and learning how to learn domains. And that's what faculty have really enjoyed by exploring this concept. So we want to integrate your course design. We want to have this alignment of outcomes, assessments, and activities. One of the things that I was doing much of the time that when Dee was coming up with this, as I was presenting for the Center for Teaching and Learning at the Minnesota State Colleges and University system level, was giving people an idea that I want you to think of course design as a suspension bridge. We have outcomes as being one of the standards that holds up the bridge. We have assessments to make sure that we hold up the other end of the standard in course design. And the bridge deck in between really becomes the learning activities. I think that this helps you kind of picture why the outcomes are important, the assessments are important, and the learning activities are important. Now, let's think about this as backwards design. Oftentimes people, when you're starting to redesign a course or you're going to design a brand new course, they start with the outcomes. That seems like a logical thing. They also start to create the learning activities. But the problem with that gets to be, you don't always set up learning activities that are going to lead well toward the assessments. And in going through this process, oftentimes people will get to the assessments. And as we, both Karen, who's doing the recording for me today, and I have seen as we have assessed people's courses before and given them feedback on those courses, we see that people's assessments don't always line up well with their outcomes. And so it's important in this backwards design approach to be able to take a look at the outcomes, and then how are you going to assess that immediately next. So you're going to find that in this chapter, we're going to ask you to take a look at those assessments next, and then finally create these bridging learning activities that get you from the outcomes, that give the students the practice, and they lead to assessments so that they will be successful with that. Again, developing outcomes. Let's take a look at this. So the foundational knowledge, this is that more basic category, the foundational category. They include the verbs that you can see here. And these verbs all stress gaining information for the student. So one of the things that I want you to really consider is, as we look at this, at the bottom, these bullets are really examples of foundational knowledge outcomes. So list the 5 steps, describe the meaning of plate tectonics, identify the 4 main factors, okay? These are basic foundational knowledge kinds of things. Now, more recently, as we've done other presentations for conferences, we've really been talking about how AI does a lot of this work for students. And so one of the things that we want to do is, yes, this is important information. And this is the kind of thing that AI can spit out very, very easily. So when we do this and when we want to assess this, we may want to think about how AI is going to come into this. Still important for students to be able to do this. However, this tends to be more laborious kind of work. This tends to be the read and repeat it kind of information. And so we're going to really stress that you do more with it beyond creating these foundations. Now, let's take a look at the next domain, which was application. And you can see here in the book, we've provided you some of the nouns that work great for this. These verbs all stress using the information in some way. So an example would be, my hope is that by the end of the course, all students will be able to design or develop, test, document custom Windows computer applications. Again, you're having them do something with them. You may have had them name them before or list them before. Now you're going to actually have them design or do something with the custom Windows computer applications. The third domain was integration. So as we look at integration and the verbs that you can see there, these verbs all stress blending information. So how are you going to get them to learn the foundation, then apply them, and now start to blend these concepts together? This is higher level thinking again, things that you want to see with your students. So one of your course outcomes might be that by the end of the course, all students will be able to align computer programming solutions to business and personal interests. It got a lot more complicated. It got a lot more sophisticated as to what you want them to do with this information. All right. Now, certainly when you have an introductory course, you're probably spending more time with students focused on this idea of foundational knowledge and application. In the middle, there's still some foundational knowledge. There's going to be more application, and you're going to start integrating. And toward the end, the higher level courses, the higher 200 level or your 400 level courses for 4-year institutions, you want to get them thinking about a little foundational knowledge, more application, but a lot of alignment. How do you start to really piece these different concepts together and use them in new ways? All right, now let's move on to the affective side of the wheel, which is going to be those 3 domains, starting with human dimension self. So again, look at the verbs that you can see in the first paragraph here. You're going to discern, discuss, display, express. And these verbs stress observing and applying course information to themselves and others. So in the self, how is this information affecting you? What's it doing for you? How are you changing? Getting those questions there. And you can see that all students will be able to, with the examples at the bottom, gain confidence that they can do something well. You can define what the something is. That they can gain a new self-ideal. You want students to view themselves as a professional in this field, whether it be an engineer, a journalist, a writer, etc. You want them to express a sense of personal responsibility. It's a little bit of that idea of that they can do excellent work in this area because of how it's changing them. When we look at human dimension others, now we take a look at the same verbs, but we are observing and applying course content to others. So how do they work well in a team or effectively in a team? How do they interact well with other people who have different ideas or who are different from themselves by age, race, religion, nationality, language, sexual orientation, gender, etc.? How do you look at how are you accepting, how are you working with people who have different thoughts and ideas than you do? Because as we know, employers want people who are able to do that. That's an essential skill. So let's take a look at the fifth piece of the pie chart there, the wheel, which is the caring and valuing part. And when you look at these, you'll see some of the same verbs. However, these verbs are really stressing how students can express values that they are discovering during the learning in your course. So these might be develop an interest in engaging with art and the value its role in communicating abstract concepts about religion and society. These are actually people who have taken our course. These are people who have created real outcomes as a result of this. How can they value the cultures and contributions of other immigrant groups? This is, again, a way to be able to use cultural pedagogy in here, where we really start to take a look at others and the contributions of others as they have come in, the contribution of immigrants into the United States or into the country that you're living in right now. How are they being able to bring in their own personal, social, and national experiences to be able to share what they're valuing by learning the things, the content in your course? And finally, the piece that we're probably most negligent in is the learning how to learn piece. And you can see, again, the verbs don't necessarily get newer or any different, but we really want to stress verbs or use verbs that are talking about planning for the future. How are they going to use this in the rest of your curriculum? How are they going to use this in lifelong learning? How are they going to use this in the workplace? So create a future learning plan to continue to grow as a professional in the workplace, or personally, if the topic is more of an interest than a work position. So really, when you look at it, how are they going to take this learning and do something with it once they've left your course, once they've graduated from your institution? What is it they're going to be able to do with this? So as you create this, one of the things that we talked about in OCDI 1 was the big dream. And so the 5 greatest challenges people had, whether they're faculty or they're instructional designers in developing outcomes, was that the outcomes weren't linked to their big dream. And you'll see that on some exercises that we're going to go through in a minute. But when you look at that, they're not linked to the big dream. They need to be linked in so that everything makes sense for students and you've communicated what you want them to do. Big dream, that overarching idea, outcomes, really getting a chance to take a look at the specifics as to how you're going to get them there, what you want them to achieve. Sometimes they tie too many things in one outcome. In other words, they use several verbs that can fall in multiple domains. It's confusing for the faculty member or the designer. It's confused for the student. confusing for the students. So one of the things you want them to do is, it's at least when you're putting this together and you're planning the design, use one verb per outcome. Sometimes people start writing content or they create learning activities. There's a lot of times when Karen and I have looked through people's courses in the past, through Quality Matters and through myself, my work as a dean, when we worked with online courses and with faculty and working as Karen did, leading the curriculum committee for our institution. One of the things that we started to see is that people were writing learning activities. They were talking about how they're going to do this. They're not talking about what they want students to be able to do for the learning outcomes. So again, choose appropriate verbs for the skill level and the course level. More foundational level for the early on introductory courses, more of the integration level for those courses that are coming in the 200s, the 400s. And then finally, writing outcomes that are appropriate for each kind, each domain. One of the things that's different, again, I mentioned it before, in the Fink model for significant learning, you should have one of those, at least one outcome for every one of those domains. It may not be that way in Bloom's model. So it really takes some thinking to be able to put that in there and to be able to use that so that your students get that holistic approach to your course. Okay, so some examples that I want to provide with you here when you take a look at these three bullets. Understands and applies concepts and perspectives on key global issues and dynamics. This was somebody's outcome, all right? But you can see that, first of all, they use the word understands. I'm not sure how you measure the understands part. So one of my advice pieces is get rid of understands. It doesn't really help you. It doesn't really tell you how to measure it. And students are really easy to, it's easy for them to use. Well, I understand that. I know that. Well, understand and knowing does not mean that you can actually do something with it. And what does that really tell you to do? Applying it means that you're going to have them do something with it. So I think what they meant was they wanted to have something from a foundational knowledge, and they wanted to have something from a application standpoint, and they put them in the same thing. Oftentimes, when you write the assessment for that, you're not going to remember to assess for both of those there. Identify and analyze. Again, foundational knowledge, and the analysis is going to be an application. You also get into this whole idea of tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTPs, to evaluate the modus operandi of cyber adversaries, blah, 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 as it keeps going on. And when you look at that, this is very academically written. It's not very student-centered written. And when you look at that, does a student know what they're going to need to do for this? How are they going to achieve this? So be very, very careful when you go in there. There's a lot of stuff to unpack in that particular outcome. And then finally, we have someone that used three. They're going to recall, they're going to explain, and they're going to apply the concepts, knowledge, and vocabulary. A lot of stuff going on there too. And for a student, how do you know that you got them all? And as a faculty designer, instructional designer, how is it that you're going to make sure that you have now assessed for all of those pieces? So again, when you look at those, writing content and learning activities, students are going to write, direct, and produce a professional level radio play. That's a how, that's not a what, okay? They're going to write a research study with applications. There again, that's a learning activity. That's a way to get to an outcome, all right? For choosing appropriate verbs, for learning outcomes, describe the high-level functions and interactions between the protocol layers of network protocol stacks. Okay, so there's a lot of things going on there. So as you go through there, make sure that you've broken this down so that you have one verb for each learning outcome, and that you've chosen the appropriate ones that you're going to be able to measure. Okay, and then finally, vague language. Explain the purpose and workings of the link network, et cetera, et cetera. And do you notice if you don't know what IP, TCP, and UDP protocols are, there's a problem. And so you really shouldn't use acronyms or those kinds of things there, because we don't know what that means. As a person who looks at that, That's not my area, so I don't understand it, but you should make it so that everybody else who's a novice or who's at a level that doesn't know that yet will be able to start to identify what that's going to be. Now, I apologize for being so small, but you're going to find this in your book. This is what we've got in there for you to take a look at, but this is how we start to break this down. And here's an example of how we used learning outcomes for the foundational knowledge, for the application, integration. It breaks it down here so that all students are going to be able to see how these align. And that becomes an example that you can look at when you see this in the book. The format that we give you to start to design yours is what we call the 6-column table. 6-column table has a place at the top for your big dream. Put that in there so you remember and you keep referring back to it. Now, what you can see here in this part is that we ask faculty and designers to only work with the course outcomes first. Work with your course outcomes. The verbs to consider are the same ones that we gave you back in the chapter of the book. We also have unit objectives or competencies, because some of you are working with competencies or objectives, and you want to break these sort of bigger course outcomes into smaller bite-sized pieces for students. So there's a place for you to do that. You may use it or you may not have to use it, but it's there for you to decide. We only have you do the outcomes first. The easiest thing is that people want to fill left to right, and they want to just fill in the whole chart in one area. But to make sure that you have outcomes for each of the 6 areas, we ask that you really look at the 6 domains and use your outcomes that you want to be able to put in there first. Most of you probably have outcomes that are set up for the cognitive, foundational knowledge, application, integration, that probably exist already for you. You're well familiar with those. The ones you don't have are going to be the affective sides, where you want to see students perform and get the richness of what their experience in your course is all about. All right, so we've also included in here, it's not in the book, but it's included in this course, a kind of a rubric for you to take a look at about your big dream statement, about your course outcomes, that they're written appropriately, that they're constructed appropriately, and there's a difference between those, and you can see those as you go through that they do align with one another. As it's going to go through, you're going to have to see the rest of them, the rest of the parts to this chapter to see the alignment piece. But there is a rubric that's in here for the 6-column table that we've included. So when you're done, here's what it's going to look like. Your course outcomes are here, your foundational knowledge, your application. You're going to have some that are there for each one of the domains. All right, now let's talk assessments. That's going to be the second piece. Once you've got your outcomes done, you know that you have formative and summative assessments. The formative ones, those are the lower stake assessments. They form or guide the direction of learning. They offer you a lot of feedback about how the students are progressing, and they provide benchmarks for students so they can actually measure their learning progress. Now, here's what happens a lot of times in formative assessments. People have used tests, quizzes, online discussions, assignments. You'll notice we have a variety of assessments being offered for students to be able to gain some things from there. Great opportunities to be able to see for themselves what they need to do. Low stakes, a few points, they get to go there, they have an idea of what they need to improve upon. Let's look at the summative assessments. These again are your bigger assessments. You'll notice I'm not saying tests. These are assessments. They're going to measure the learning that goes on there. They're going to measure the degree that a student has mastered the course outcomes. And you can also create assessments, these larger ones, that can assess more than one outcome at a time. So one assessment might measure 3 outcomes or 2 outcomes. All right. And then the summative assessments will look like capstone projects, student portfolios, some sort of a comprehensive project or a paper that can be used using one summative assessment to measure, again, one outcome or several outcomes, depending how you want to set up a rubric to be able to get students to see that they need to include those. Summatives are the bigger ones. You've given them practice with the formative assessments. Now you're increasing on the summative assessments. Different idea, backward looking, forward looking. We're going to tie this back into the domains. How many of you remember the backward looking kinds of test questions you had to take? What are the definition of race relations? Who invented the Xerox copying machine? Remember those days? Okay, I do. Some of these were multiple choice. Some of them were short answer and you had to write them out, all right? So backward-looking assessments usually require memorization. They include tests that use multiple choice, true, false, those kinds of things. Measure foundational knowledge. Get that, it's very important. They measure the easier foundational knowledge kinds of things. You want students to know something, to memorize it, to be able to identify it, and then you're going to test them on that. Many learning platforms that you're going to have will automatically grade these kinds of quizzes or surveys or something that way, and they'll give immediate feedback to students. This is the easy stuff. This is the stuff AI comes up with right now. So you want to watch the amount that you actually have your students going and doing backward-looking assessments. They can help students develop the foundation for the next stages of what they're going to learn in the course. They can also be self-assessed. Students can do this for themselves. You don't have to spend a lot of time giving tests out like this. They can be done automatically, like I said, through the learning management system. They can be done where students can learn, look at it, retake the test again themselves to see that they've got the knowledge to be able to continue on. Forward-looking assessments. These are going to be the kinds of assessments. Discuss how you can use the reading this week in your current or future job. How would you respond to a customer or colleague who has a concern about the service they receive? Now they have to apply, they have to integrate, they have to maybe, again, begin looking at the human dimensions and other pieces of the pie. They're great for all of the rest of the domains in the taxonomy besides foundational knowledge. You can use case studies, role-playing, student research, inquiry method, debate, problem solving, and team-based learning kinds of learning activities and assessments for this. They provide much richer experiences for students, and they're developing the higher level thinking. So consequently, these assessments become extremely important. These are the assessments that students are going to remember when they leave your course. They're not going to remember the assessments of how well they did on the third quiz in week number 4. They're not going to remember that. They're going to have a score from that that's going to help you maybe get a grade. But the important part of that assessment was to sort of show what you know and what you don't know, so that you begin to work toward these bigger assessments, forward-looking assessments that they can actually show and use their thinking about what it is that they're going to do. So when you're looking at this, use some backward-looking assessments for foundational knowledge, forward for the rest of the taxonomy. As a result, balance your backward and forward-looking assessments. If all you're giving is quizzes, you got too many backward-looking ones. If you're just doing case studies and you're not giving students a chance to practice on some of the foundational knowledge stuff, then you don't have much of a balance there. Again, a course that is a higher level course, upper 200s or 400 level courses, really need to be using a lot of forward-looking assessments. They should be learning experiences. I think sometimes people confuse if it's an assessment or if it's a learning experience, learning activity. They do that, but because of the feedback you're going to be able to provide for students, you really need to think about what it is you're going to be able to do. Using, again, formative and summative assessments in your design, so they have a chance to practice to get ready. And a lot of your learning activities can lead toward those summative assessments. And the most important thing that you can do as the designer is develop the rubrics, communicate what your expectations are to students when they're mastering those. So the next thing we want you to be able to do is add those learning assessments. Go back to your learner outcomes, then look at the assessments. How are you going to do that? And if you look at this person who created this model, you will see many different kinds of assessments. This is in your book. Those of you who have the ebook, it's on page 63, take a look at it. And you can use in table 8.2, chapter 8, a taxonomy for that, and I'll show you that in just a minute. So in the course, we now have people just simply look at the assessments. We also provided a place for time and resources. So when you think about that, how much time is this going to take for you to be able to deliver these assessments? What resources might you need? Whether it's technology, whether it's lab, whatever it happens to be, what are those time and resources going to take as you go through here? Because you need to make sure you get everything done in your 8-week course, 16-week course, whatever it happens to be. All right. Again, for assessments, go back to that 6-column table rubric. It's there for you to be able to use. You'll enjoy that. Finally, we get to learning activities. So the learning activities really, again, go back to that bridge picture. They need to link the outcomes and the assessments. This is where you spend the greatest majority of your course time and energy. It's the biggest visible part to the students are the learning activities. This really tells students what they want to know, which is, why do I need to know this? What do I need to do? This is what learning activities do. Active learning certainly can create greater student engagement. And then this also, by doing the learning activities, you're going to practice the skills and thinking as they model the work for a student's future career. Don't do things that aren't going to take them into the future as to what they need to be able to do. Developing the thinking, the skills, whatever it is, all of these should be able to do that. So a couple different things. One, the foundational knowledge outcomes may need fewer learning activities. Higher level outcomes in the application, integration, analysis may need 2 or 3 or more of these kinds of learning activities for the practice. Identify the complexity and the purpose of the activity. What's it going to do? How is it going to be the bridge deck? How is it going to get you where you need to go? Predict the amount of practice that a student needs. As you do this course and you design this course, how much practice do you think novices need to become experts? How are you going to be able to get them and provide the time? Some of that can be in class, some of that can be outside of class, but yet you're still getting them to put in the time and effort they need. And then finally, when they do the activity, is this to meet one outcome or will it meet several outcomes? And get students to talk about that, of how they're meeting the outcomes by doing the learning activities. That will gain you much credence when you go to the actual assessment. Okay, so is the activity that you're designing part of a set of learning practice which sort of scaffolds up to higher level? And it could be within your course, it can be for the next course or the course after that. How are you building this? And where does this fit into everybody else's courses and the other kinds of practice that you need to give students? And then time and equipment. When you think about that, will the students have the access to what they need to be able to do to complete the activity effectively? There's nothing worse than getting in the middle of this activity and suddenly finding out we don't have the time. This is how it would have been. You should have, we could have gone faster, but, make sure that the pacing is going to be set up fine. And do you need to break it into chunks so that the time and the equipment, which may be limited, will get you where you need to be able to go? Access the effectiveness of the activities, by having former students take a look. This is test driving again, having former students take a look at these activities and see if they think this would have improved their learning experience. All of these are in the book. They're great places for you to do this. This is the table 8.2 I pointed out. You can page back to table 8.2. This gives you an opportunity to, one, on the left-hand side, look at the foundational knowledge. This is the taxonomy domain. Then it tells you if it's informal or formal or both, how you can deliver that. It talks about whether this is formative or summative, or perhaps both, the ways that you can use it. All of the assessments and learning activities are listed in here. So if you're stuck and you're doing quiz, or reading, what are some other things that you can be doing? You have a plethora of activities here. And in table 8.2, all of the domains have these listed out here as to ways you can use them. It also talks about learning types. Are these active, passive, connective, or reflective as you go through there? How do you really work with those? And then finally, what are some of the technological requirements you may need to be able to perform these? So as you can see, this is the application one. You've got the other 4 areas also in table 8.2. And by getting the book, which you got with your course, you're going to be able to have access to all of these. Some of you may like this kind of a wheel. This is an important piece. It's not in the book, unfortunately. Came up with it afterwards, but it's the same information. It's just put into a wheel look. So this is really table 8.2 done in wheel form, so that you can see the domains are in the middle, the outcome verbs are next, and finally the assessment and learning activities are in the outer sphere, and you can take a look at those. Now, again, when you're looking at the crosswalk, have you chosen a balance in a variety of the activities for the unit? So these are all important ways to do that. Look at your activities that you have in your course. Identify if they're passive or active, connective, reflective, and be able to talk about the different ways that you're using them so that you have a balance. When you look at all of this in a course, now you satisfy both introverts and extroverts. You satisfy many different preferences in learning, because the way I like to learn is written in here. I get a chance to do that, but I also have to expand and be able to do others, and you push me a lot. One of our participants in the live session talked about they're excited to line everything up, the outcomes, the assessments, the activities. I speak to students about how activities fit into the outcomes the program is committed to. So this work reinforces and strengthens it. I see lots of room for improvement, but think this works better for faculty and students. It's what I've been striving for on a mostly informal trial and error basis. So this gives you some structure to be able to take a look at it. And when you're done, you can also see this example from the book. This is again going back to the 3-column table where you see the domains, you see the outcomes, the assessments, the learning activities. Provides an excellent example as to how these all line up and how you can get students to see that they have a very enriching course here that's going to engage them in a variety of ways. So we finally have faculty go through in the worksheet that you're given to be able to break this down and use your learning activities. Again, time and resources become important, so you get the pacing set. And if you notice, both in the assessments and the learning activities, we added this during the pandemic. We really talk about dual delivery. How would you do this face-to-face? How would you do this in an online situation? So that if you have to pivot for another pandemic, or Karen and I are both from Minnesota, and we have snow days and things close down, you could pivot and you don't lose your Thursday night course because of a snowstorm. You suddenly are able to go online and you do the assessment in a different way. or you do the learning activity in a different way because you've designed for it already. It's not a shock, it's just something you can do. There is also a part of the 6-column table rubric that talks about learning activities. So you can look there. And applying this model will only provide me with more confidence to teach what I'm passionate about. It also engages students that will carry their experiences with them for years to come. And that's exactly what this design will help you create. Excuse me. Thanks for joining our review of Chapter 2. We hope you enjoy it. Good luck with the activities and filling those kinds of things in. And we wish you the best of luck as you design your own courses or redesign your courses.